So what I tried to do here was make a grill-friendly version of the original Spanish paella, the Paella Valenciana, which many consider the true paella. This dish was invented to feed massive teams of farmhands, which is why it was traditionally cooked in these large, specialized pans. Which is kind of redundant because paella also means pan. So paella cooked in a paella pan means pan cooked in pan. Anyways, I'm using a smaller 15-inch pan that fits comfortably on my grill. This size should make enough paella to serve about 3 to 4 guests, or as dinner for 2 with some leftovers. The key thing here is that the rice should be no more than half an inch thick on the pan. So if you want to make more, you can't just pile more on top. You gotta use a bigger pan or make it in batches. These pans also have a slight dip towards the middle. This allows the oil to pool when sauteing, but if you don't have one, just use any large flat metal pan. But skip the enamel coated ones. The coating will not be able to take the direct heat without getting damaged. The authentic way to cook the paella would be on a fixed grate over an open fire, but I think I found a much more forgiving way to cook it without burning the damn thing. And get that perfect crunchy socorat layer, which most agree is the best part of the paella. Okay, so first thing I got started with was the protein. Traditional paella has some combination of pork, chicken, or rabbit. Some regional variations also use snails. I'm just going to keep it simple and use chicken for mine. Here are some skin-on, bone-in chicken drumsticks. I'm using about 5 for these, 2 for me, 2 for my wife, and 1 for the Cookie Monster. I started by scoring my chicken. This lets the seasoning penetrate deeper into the meat, and it also speeds up the cooking process. Make sure to season the chicken evenly on both sides. I know I'm going to get some flack for this, but I'm also going to coat the chicken with a mixture of mayo and garlic. I'm using about half a cup of mayo and 5 minced cloves of garlic. I know this is not the authentic way to do this, but it just makes the chicken way more flavorful. The mayo acts as a non-stick layer for the chicken and helps you get more of those crispy, crunchy brown bits that are awesome. The next ingredient for the paella are the tomatoes. Feel free to use whatever kind of tomatoes you have on hand. I used about 12 ounces of cherry tomatoes. I pureed them with my food processor, but you can also grate them as well. Most authentic paella recipes tend to use some combination of green beans or lima beans. I'm just using plain regular green beans for mine. These are pretty common and you can find them in most grocery stores. The only prep that was needed for these was to wash them and trim off the ends. I'm also going to season these with salt, pepper, and a little bit of the garlic mayo mix. For the liquid, the authentic recipes usually call for just water, but I'm going to use vegetable stock for a bit more flavor. But chicken stock would also work too and would probably be a bit better. I used 1 whole carton, which is about 900 milliliters, and mixed it with about half a cup of water. The paella rice is super absorbent, so it's always best to keep some more liquid on hand just in case you need to add it if the rice starts to dry up. The main thing here is that this liquid has to be hot, because when you put it in the rice, the temperature of the pan should not drop. So what I usually do is heat up the liquid and keep it on a burner on low heat so it stays warm until I need it. Okay, now for the grill. I always find that whenever I use lump charcoal, a good bit of it always ends up falling between my charcoal grates, so I ended up getting this mini grate to hold things together. It's got smaller holes than the original grate, so hopefully this should keep the charcoal from falling through. I'm using my vortex again for this, but this time I'm flipping it upside down. This way the heat is not just concentrated in the center and is more dispersed evenly across the bottom of the pan. Okay, now in the charcoal, I fill the vortex up about halfway. This works out to be approximately 1 chimney's worth of charcoal. The tricky part of cooking paellas on charcoal grills is heat management. If you want to keep the heat up, you have to take the pan off and then lift the grate. This is a bit tricky, especially when you're working with a shallow rimmed pan filled with hot liquid. On the flip side, if you need to cool it down, you need to have something like bricks on hand to lift the pan up, or just take it off the grill altogether. But again, shallow pan, hot liquid. Okay, so in my opinion, this is actually the perfect use case for a Santa Maria grill. These grills basically work like an elevator for your grates. Need more heat? Lower it down. Need to cool things down? Lift it up. Also, because the grate can be lifted up with the pan on it, it's super easy to add more charcoal. I got mine as an attachment that goes over my existing grill, but they sell these as standalone grills as well. Once the grates are hot, I put the chicken and the green beans on and lifted them about a foot off the direct charcoals. While they cooked, I prepped the saffron. This stuff is pretty expensive, so I just used a pinch. To make the most of it, I heated it up in some foil and then let it steep in the hot broth. The green beans will cook for about 10 minutes and the chicken should take about 15 to 20 minutes. Full disclosure here, cooking the veggies and chicken this way does deviate from the authentic recipes a bit because the chicken's not cooked on the pan, but grilled chicken is way better than pan-fried chicken, in my opinion. It's got a smokier flavor, And because we're cooking it hot and fast, it's also usually juicier. Once the chicken and beans were cooked, I took them off and set them aside for a bit. Okay, now it's paella time. First things first, I need to crank up the temperature a bit, so I added a few more pieces of charcoal. Now on went the paella pan with about half a cup of olive oil. The trick here is to get the pan level, otherwise everything will pull on one side or the other and the paella will not cook evenly. Once the oil was hot, in went the tomatoes. I'd recommend standing back for a bit. If the pan's hot enough, the puree will actually splatter a bit, so just to be safe, just stand back a couple of steps. Once it settles down, I kept stirring it until it was cooked and all the water evaporated. At this point, the tomatoes should also start to get a deep red color and caramelize, but be sure not to let it burn. Now it's time for the rice. In went about 220 grams of bomba rice, which is a specific type of Spanish rice that's used almost exclusively for paellas. If you don't have this, arborio or any other short grain rice varieties will also work in a pinch. If you're like me and you don't live in the EU, this can be a bit hard to find, so I had to order mine from Amazon. It usually comes in these 1 kilogram bags, and I got mine for about 20 bucks. The whole bag should be good for about 4 paellas if you use my recipe. When you put the rice on, try to get it as evenly spread as possible. Don't be afraid to even take it off for a second or two and give it a shake. Doing this now is much easier than doing this after you add the stock. After toasting the rice for about 2 minutes, in went about 3/4 of the liquid. I'll add the rest as needed as I cook. The trick here is to keep the pan flat so the rice and broth don't pool to one side. This is a bit tricky with this setup because the platform has a bit of side-to-side give. This is great for getting grates to move up and down, but not so much for keeping things level. So what I had to do was MacGyver this a bit and hold on to one side to keep things flat. If the pan was getting too hot, I could crank the grates up, and if I needed more heat, I could put more coals underneath. I think the heat management and temperature control was an acceptable trade-off for having to hold things steady for a bit. I also added 1 sprig of rosemary for flavor. Now I waited until the water started to evaporate. While I waited, I tasted the rice for doneness. If I saw that some sides were still raw, but the liquid was starting to dry up, I added more liquid to that spot. This rice is super absorbent, so it's really hard to get it to a point where it starts to get mushy. Okay, so now back in with the chicken and veggies. Once the rice was almost cooked and the liquid was starting to get just below the top of the rice, I used a pair of toothpicks to check how much moisture was under the rice and what the bottom of the pan felt like. This is important. I'm using a carbon steel pan, so if the bottom felt smooth, it meant that there was still liquid and the rice needed to cook. If the bottom started to feel sticky, it meant that the starches and fats were starting to form what's known as a sauerkraut, which is the crunchy brown bits you get at the bottom of a really well-made paella. But if it felt hard and rough all over, you may have burned the paella and you should smell it by now. What I'm making now is my family's dinner, so I'm not taking a lot of chances here with getting that perfect sauerkraut because the difference between a perfect sauerkraut and burning it is literally a few seconds. Also, scrubbing burnt paella off a pan is no fun. I pulled mine off once the liquid wasn't visible anymore and the sauerkraut was starting to form in several places. After letting it rest for about 15 minutes or so, it was time to try it out. I would recommend using something wide and firm to really scrape those crunchy bits off the bottom. Also, this is usually had with some lemon, so I drizzled on some lemon juice. Now give this a taste. Now this does not taste like some homemade take on Paella Valenciana. This tastes like the authentic Paella Valenciana. And best of all, you can just make it at home on your grill. So try it out.